I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. Hello, I'm here with Mike Hennessy today. Nice to see you, Mike.
Nice to see you.
Now, Mike, you'll hear immediately, is from England. He's actually in England at the moment. We're both in lockdown, so thank goodness for Zoom. And actually, I discovered in our correspondence, we both come from close to Liverpool. I'm a woolly back coming from across the Mersey, and anybody wants to know what that is, you can ask me later, right, is what I would say. But what we're here to talk about is Pontifex University Press is about to publish another collection of essays by Father Vincent McNabb. And we were looking for somebody to write a foreword to this, and my colleague Charlie Deist noticed that these essays on McNabb were appearing on the Belloc website. I think it's the Belloc Society website. I think that's where we saw them, written by Mike in England. And so we just approached him and said, would you be interested in writing a foreword to this collection of essays? We were intrigued not just by what you were writing, but also that it was clear you had an interest in Belloc. And so we thought that would be a very interesting connection. So we wrote and asked, and Mike agreed, and so wrote a terrific foreword to the book. So what I'd like you to do first, Mike, is just tell us a little bit about yourself and your faith, and your general interest, how that impacts upon your general interest in Belloc and McNabb. And then what we'll do, we'll get on to what it is about the book that interested you particularly. So tell us about yourself.
Very, very happy to help. In a sense, I'm born and raised a Catholic up in Liverpool, as you mentioned, up in the northwest of England. And my parents had a very strong sense of history. And they loved the stories of the martyrs, and we visited lots of historical monuments as a child. And I was always conscious as I was growing up, and I ended up reading history at university, that there was this chap called Belloc, who was a famous Catholic historian. And it was Belloc, in a sense, I fell in love with first as an author. I remember the muse sort of striking me in Didcot Station, which is this very dreary station midway between sort of Oxford and Reading, when I was a young man, maybe just 19 years old. And the personality of Belloc and what he wrote sort of washed over me, and I felt myself quite captivated by him. Reading about him, and then, of course, reading about the people who he refers to or are referred to in biographies about him, so G.K. Chesterton. And one of the prominent people, of course, who came across in that biography of Belloc, the Robert Speight biography, the big book, was, of course, Father McNabb. And it was a name I'd sort of come across in my reading and my sort of studies about the personality of Belloc. And I decided I want to pursue it more, but it was definitely difficult to get hold of any of his books. Anyway, I'm married, early 20s, lived in North London, reading a lot of Belloc, collecting a lot of Belloc and Chesterton. And it was not until we were moving out of London, our family was growing and based outside London in Reading, that I managed to get hold of a couple of his books. And I'm, as it happens, an official. I work in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Commons as a parliamentary official. And so I was quite captivated as well by some of the political sides of Belloc. He was actually a member of Parliament for a while. It was in that context, that political context, that he actually first came across Vincent McNabb, who was very concerned about the condition of the working class.
Right.
And as a father of at that time young children, as someone who had to move out of London because I couldn't afford the property prices, as someone who was observing the political scene in Westminster, that sort of element of the very strong and devout faith of McNabb, the relationship with Belloc, whom I loved and revered, and some of the insights he gave into the economic and social problems of his day, many of which still perdure to this day, really became a focus for my interest. And so I started to read more and then actually to write some about him.
Right. So this request to write the foreword landed in your inbox.
Yes.
And what appealed about it?
Well, to be absolutely frank, what really appealed was that I hadn't actually written anything about McNabb for a number of years.
Okay.
I'd written 2 or 3 quite long articles about him. I'd actually been planning to write a biography of him going back 15 or 20 years. I got in touch with the Dominican archivist, Father Bede Bailey, who's now sadly passed away in this country, in order to visit the Dominican archive and pick up some of the correspondence they have, which belonged to Father McNabb. And then just because life is very busy, all sorts of other things got in the way. Other characters who roamed the sort of the world of the 20s, 30s, and 40s began to fascinate me as well. I sort of took a little bit to one side. I gave a talk about him in 2016, and I had to revisit some of my older writings, and sort of he was prominent again in my mind in a different way. There were other elements of him that I was drawn to more than I had been when I first read him. But again, he's sort of busyness of life. 2 or 3 years, I'd not really gone near a lot of his writings. I picked them up from time to time, especially some of his scriptural meditations during Lent. I always look at those. And so when that email dropped in, I thought, this is my chance to revisit this man and to sort of go back and to read him again and to look again at what he contributed to if you like, the Catholic and the broader English literary and intellectual scene. And also, of course, he was a man of faith. He worked amongst the poor. So there was an awful lot in terms of what he did charitably for the people of London in particular. But to go back and to sort of look at that again in a new light as an older man myself, now with my children more grown than they were then. So it was a godsend in a way.
Well, that's wonderful. Just so that those who are listening are aware, the book is called The Wayside, A Priest's Gleanings, and it's a series of short essays. And the way that it struck me when I was writing it is that Father McNabb, some of his writing is pretty technical and difficult, I would say. I mean, he has this reputation of being linked to the land movement, and so you feel as though you ought to be able to just sort of read him like you can Belloc. But he is a serious philosopher and theologian. And when he's writing for others, for his peers, shall we say, it's difficult reading. This has a collection of very personal reflections that are different, and they're early essays. And you noted that in your foreword. I'm just going to quote this sentence and just ask you to comment on it. So this is what Michael wrote, which I thought was a beautiful thing to write about Father McNabb. McNabb wasn't as great a writer as he was a thinker, and he wasn't as great a thinker as he was a lover of God. Now, would that anyone would say something like that about either of us at some point in the future?
Indeed.
But I think it's true. And you mentioned 2 stories in particular which bring out that side of his character, and it struck me as well. So perhaps if you can just talk about that and any others that highlight this aspect of his personality and his personal charity, I think.
It's a fascinating volume that you've chosen. It gives, I think, the best representation of the breadth of the things that he was writing about and the things that he was concerned about. And indeed, he was a very, very gifted theologian. He had his lectorate in sacred theology and his master of sacred theology from Louvain University. He was supposed to be the second brightest mind of his generation in the Dominican province in England. And a lot of what he wrote was technical, and he can continue to write quite technical theological writings for Blackfriars magazine. But he wrote an awful lot of other things as well. He wrote some beautiful, limpid scriptural studies. He wrote often articles, even for the secular press in London in the 1920s and 30s, talking in very simple terms about the social issues and the political issues of the day. And what motivated him fundamentally in everything that he did, whether it was the high exegesis and the philosophical work that he was doing, or the more simple work, was a profound love for our blessed Lord and a love for his fellow man. And those articles I touch on in the foreword, one about a nonconformist, an elderly woman who had been, I think, a weaver, Jane Seedcombe. Another about an Irish convict, Patrick Glennon, who's been locked up again and again and again, and an alcoholic, are full of an enormous love for the people around him, which is there because of his love of Almighty God. And that's what moved me most when I was reading this collection. Again, I've read it a number of times before. I've got a crusty old first edition. And when I first read it, I was drawn to some of his other essays, some of the more technical ones. He has in here a critique of Harnack's work on miracles, and he has another critique on Hume, quite a philosophical critique of Hume. He writes a couple of historical essays in here, one about Rome at the time of the pagans, another about Rome at the time of the Christians. There's even a little sort of sidelight on post-impressionism in this
Yeah.
book. But it was when he was writing about individuals here that I was really moved. There's actually another one towards the end of the book, and it's written about a conversation he has with someone he doesn't name, who isn't of the household of the faith, but is clearly a Christian. And he is so touched by her tender love for our Lord Jesus Christ that he begins to think, if only I could even approach that level of devotion towards our blessed Lord. I would be so pleased if I could even approach only half that way to where this other woman, this old woman he meets, has got to. And it's that humility within him. He was very clear about the certainties of the faith, and he was clear that there is really one household of the faith to which we should try and draw everybody else. But it never meant that he didn't see in other people the light of our blessed Lord. And that's one of the lovely things about this. As he got older, this book came out in 1915, and some of the essays date back sort of 5 or 10 years before that. As he got older, he was writing more controversially. He was writing more on matters to do with the condition of the working classes, some political elements, back to the land essays, which he's quite famous for, distributism. And it's in these earlier ones that you can actually see the personality of him developing and growing. And at the heart of that, as I say, this glowing love for our blessed Lord and all the people around him. And that's what, each time I go back to him, as I say, return to him from time to time, I catch something else about his personality that really strikes me. And I think they were the things that most drew me to this volume this time round.
Yes, in that description of the alcoholic prisoner, it is amazing reading it. First of all, he describes his contact with the prisoner and how, clearly he'd done something wrong to be there. He wasn't trying to excuse that, but he'd been on the receiving end of injustice in his life.
Yes.
And he remarks on his capacity for forgiveness and his lack of resentment in describing this. And then finishes with a description of going in, and the prisoner wasn't there. Presumably, I think he died.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And the prisoner who was in the cell said, "Oh, that guy was a saint," talking about the alcoholic prisoner in the prison. As you say, touching and just revealing, I think, not only about his relationship with the prisoner, but the fact that when he met this stranger going in, immediately there's this, there must be a connection there for this guy to open up and want to say something like that to him. As you say, really interesting insights into his personality. I'm just curious, but I'll just say for a moment, those who are listening, I'm here with Mike Hennessy, and we're discussing a book of essays which Pontifex University Press is about to release, called The Wayside, A Priest's Gleanings, a series of essays by Father Vincent McNabb. If you want to get the book, it's on thewayofbeauty.org/books. Thewayofbeauty.org/books. I wonder, just in the light of what we've been saying about Father McNabb himself, if perhaps bearing that in mind, could you enlarge a little bit on his relationship with Belloc? And do you know much about his contact with him and the influence he had on him at all?
Yes, it's quite a fascinating story and partly sad. One of the reasons I was drawn to McNabb was, as I reading a biography of Belloc, and almost the last thing that Belloc committed to writing in 1943 was something that was printed in Blackfriars after the death of Father McNabb, in which he effectively referred to him as one of the greatest men he had ever known and one of the holiest men he had ever known. And that was one of the things that stimulated my interest initially. And one of the reasons for that was that he'd met McNabb for the first time quite some time ago, 30 years before, in 1913. They both shared a stand as a Catholic political gathering. Socialism was making inroads into the Catholic working classes' sort of political thinking, and they were both opposed to socialism, but they saw within it many things that the Catholic Church had already expressed in the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, and they were keen to try and find a place for that, if you like, within political movements of the day. Belloc invited McNabb back to his home in Kingsland in Sussex, where he met his wife and his family. But only a few months later, Belloc sadly lost his wife Elodie Belloc, at quite an early age. They had 5 children, and she died of a sudden illness early in 1914, just before the outbreak of the First War. And MacNab was someone from London. So he spent those very, very difficult days for Hilaire Belloc, with Belloc, walking in his garden. And that's what's reflected upon in this piece by Belloc that Belloc wrote in 1943 after the death of MacNab. He said that MacNab had saved him from a loss of faith, had saved him from despair, had accompanied him in the darkest hours and darkest days of his life, just after the death of his wife. And after that, 1914, MacNab would come each Easter and each Christmas and would offer Mass in Belloc's chapel in their house in Kingsland, and they became very, very close friends. After 1919, MacNab had to move to London. He became the prior of St Dominic's Priory up in North East London. And after that, they didn't meet as often, but they did still meet and they corresponded. And a lot of the correspondence from MacNab to Belloc and Belloc to MacNab survives, and it's very touching. Eleanor Belloc, who was Hilaire Belloc's daughter, said that Vincent MacNab was almost the only man Belloc would listen to. Belloc was terribly headstrong and had very strong opinions on almost any subject, but he had a reverence for Father MacNab. When Father MacNab came to stay, Belloc would tone down his drinking a little. He was always fond of taking at least 2 or 3 good bottles of red after dinner, and he wouldn't, almost out of respect for the men's cloth, and he would listen to him. And in fact, Belloc had a stroke in 1942. This is just before MacNab died. MacNab hurried down from London. This is all those years later, they were still very close friends. And MacNab assisted at Belloc's side when people thought that Belloc was going to die in 1942. He recovered and, of course, eventually wrote this beautiful piece in Blackfriars about MacNab when MacNab himself perished a year later. They stimulated each other. They were very close friends. I think he was terribly important to Hilaire Belloc. He was this authoritative, saintly contact that he had outside the literary scene and the political scene. He was a touchstone for Belloc's faith in many ways. And for MacNab, I think it just gave him the opportunity to talk on terms about all sorts of things that they were both interested in, both in terms of politics, social conditions, economics, but also in terms of the faith and art and various other things. So they were really close, really tight-knit. And that, I think, is a lovely testimony to each of them. There's one fascinating little story, which is that Belloc's neighbour in Sussex was a famous poet, Wilfrid Scowen Blunt, and he'd been born and brought up a Catholic, but had lived a rather licentious life. And he was on his deathbed, and he summoned Belloc and said to Belloc, "I think I want a priest by my side." And Belloc actually sent for MacNab, who came and assisted at the dying bedside of Wilfrid Blunt and brought him, reconciled him to the church. So it was more than just conversation, it was more than just friendship. It actually had a practical outcome for some of those souls who were touched by their friendship, which I think was really important to it.
Yes, that's interesting. Could you tell us a little more about is it the Belloc Society and your involvement with that? And
yes.
And your interest in Belloc, and then we'll come back to MacNab and talk about a few more of the essays again.
I'm currently the chair of the Belloc Society, although we're a relatively quiescent organisation, especially now under this under the COVID-19 sort of regime. But I've been involved with the Belloc Society since about 1996, 1997, and it's come and gone. And the reason for my involvement is I've read more Belloc than almost anybody else. At an early age, as I mentioned before, in Didcot Station of all places, something touched my soul in terms of what he was writing. There's a strength to his personality, and there's a strength to his faith. He almost abandoned his faith at one point. There was a brief moment of wavering, but came back to it and pursued it. He was a great controversialist and a wonderful orator. He flirted with politics. He spent most of his life writing over 153 books, and I've got about 142 of them on the shelf behind me. I also think he's one of the most beautiful writers of English of the 20th century. I know there's a few who can claim that as well. Some people say that Evelyn Waugh is one of the greatest stylists of the 20th century. Ronald Knox is obviously a superb stylist in many ways. But Belloc wrote beautifully, and he wrote on so many different subjects and with so many different voices. He was enormously capable of turning from sardonic humour to the most sort of beautiful explanation of the aging of the soul and the aging of the spirit. He was a man full of melancholy, enormous humor, uproarious spirits, a great drinker, a sailor, would often spend time alone on a boat at night, watching the stars and reciting the Iliad to himself in Greek. A loner after his wife died, spent a lot of time, I think, still mourning his wife, and his devotion to his wife was very, very great. He never slept in the same room again after she died. He would walk past her door every evening to another room, and outside the door he would kneel down, he would kiss the wood of the door, and he would offer some prayers for the repose of the soul of his wife before going to his own room. There's an awful lot about him. He's a multifaceted individual, and he still fascinates me. And the Belloc Society now is devoted to some of the lighter elements of the man's life, to his verse, to his singing, to his poetry. One of his great poems, of course, is the heroic poem in praise of wine. I'm quite fond of a drop of wine myself. I used to actually work briefly in the wine industry here in the UK, and that poem is again a fascinating exposition of the fact that he had a background in the classics. He'd read history. He was obviously a great verse stylist. It's quite a controversial work. It attacks the water drinkers. It's full of history, and it's like a travelogue across the Mediterranean and all the places where vines grow. But it ends with a beautiful exposition of his deep, profound faith in our blessed Lord and in the Blessed Sacrament, the wine that is made, the blood of Christ, if you like. And so it's again, it covers everything. And few writers can do that with such panache as Belloc.
Well, I'm going to tell you my introduction to Belloc. Time not unlike this. So we're going back now to the early 70s, the miners' strike, when Ted Heath was Prime Minister, 3-day week, and you had power cuts for 2 days in the week. And so everyone bought candles. There was a rush on candles, I remember. I don't know how old you were at this stage. I was born in 62, so I was, I can't remember exactly when, about 10, something like that. And so what happened is my dad went down to the library. We had cold meats and cheese, and I remember my mum getting this meal ready because we weren't going to be able to cook by candlelight. And my dad went down to the library and got a book of cautionary tales by Hilaire Belloc. And I'd never heard these before. I'm the oldest of 4, and my sister, who was the youngest, is just 5 years younger. So there's 4 of us very close together. And I was absolutely captivated by these, and especially there was a boy whose name was Jim, whose friends were very kind to him. And I ever since that, I always wondered who this person was who wrote these incredibly witty lines of verse that we were all laughing. So my mum, my dad, and all the kids at the jokes that he made. And I remember buying a book as an adult. I thought I want to go and read these. So I bought a book of Belloc's verse and went straight to the one about Jim, who was eaten by the lion when he went to the zoo. And the fact that could be a funny tale is amazing. But someone said to me, "Oh yes, he's not really rated as in terms of his verse. It seems not great." Well, what I would say is that if you're looking for something to do in the lockdown, you really could do a lot worse than just reading some of those cautionary tales by Belloc. If you have a family, they are absolutely delightful. Now, I'm wondering, how do the Belloc aficionados, you've read far more of him than I have, how is his children's verse, for example, viewed?
Very highly. I mean, it's just been republished over here by a very prominent publishing company, so it's still in circulation. I think most people who know Belloc will know him because of those particular poems, the humorous verse that he's done. But I say there's so many sides to him. One of the great problems, and I often joke about this with Belloc Society friends, is that you can get 8 or 10 or even 15 Bellocians in the same room together. Terrible word, Bellocians. And you'll find that none of them agree with each other about anything. Some are there because they love his history. Some are there because they love his verse. Some love the fact that he was a man of Sussex, and Sussex is very important to them in the countryside. Some are there because of his polemics and his controversial works, whether political or social. Some just love his prose writing, I'd say the beautiful harmonies, the mellow tones of a cello, as Maurice Baring once said. Some like his novels, and some of his novels are quite political and very amusing, actually, in many ways. Some actually like his writings on economics. He wrote about so many different things, and if you were to say to every Ballockian in a room, 15 or 20, what is his best book, you would probably get 15 or 20 different answers, which is a problem for a society in some respects, but it doesn't mean that everything is kept very fresh, because there's never any unanimity on what made the man great. We just all agree that he is.
So I'm just wondering, can you all unify behind the fact that you think he's better than Chesterton? Is that the...
That is one particular element of unity. And having had an enormous affection for G.K. Chesterton as a young man, which I have to admit has waned a little, I find his style now really quite difficult to read.
I don't like him as much as Ben.
Paragraphs at a time, but pages and pages I can't be doing with that anymore. The other thing that does unite Ballockians tends to be that they're quite fond of a drink and a sing-along. And so socially, the gatherings are always, despite the elements of disagreement as to what might be his best book or the best facet of the man, we all can raise a glass together and agree he was a great man, and then have a good old sing-along. And that's very important with these sorts of literary groups of one sort or another.
Well, let's turn now again to the holy man behind the great man, if we can call it, Father MacNab. Just tell us about any other stories or any of those essays that he wrote that just appealed to you, just to give us more insights into him and this man who had such an influence on Belloc.
Indeed, I mean, as I say, the book is a great conspectus of all sorts of different things that he was interested in. One thing that struck me this time, and I've been reading some of those essays, where clearly he's mixing and working among some of the poorer people in London, or at this time actually in Leicester. He was in London briefly, 1908 to 1910. But wherever he went, he tended to be moving amongst the poorer people. He spent a lot of time with the Jews in Whitechapel in London, for example, of the poorer Jews who lived in the East End. Of course, the poor Irish working classes, whether in Liverpool or in London, again, he visited a lot and spent a lot of time with. But he's got an essay towards the end of The Wayside called The Riches of Ritual. And he talks about the importance of magnificence and beauty in liturgy and in worship. And this struck me very much coming to it again this time. I'd just been reading a few years before a book I'd not read since I was a student, which was a biography of the Curé d'Ars, who served in a very poor parish in France, but who never wanted to stint in terms of vestments and the way that the church was fitted out in order to befit the sacred liturgy. Thought it was a very, very important thing, especially in a sense for the poor people who lived in such drab surroundings, that for them, the opportunity to participate in the liturgy with the beauty attendant upon it was actually something that would raise them up out of their condition and point their minds and their hearts towards Almighty God. And so in my mind, and of course I think Father MacNab was a very holy man, I was sort of thinking about him and thinking of the Curé of Ars at the same time, and how well he explains in this short essay the importance of art itself being an offering that we can make to God, and how we must make the most glorious offering of the most glorious art to God. It's the least that is required, if you like, for us to be able to worship him well, is to worship with all that we can give him, both within our own hearts, but what we can make with our own hands, whether it's vestments or the architecture, whether it's the singing, the chant, however we offer, it's very important to do that for God. And I thought that's an interesting thing, because there's a lot of argumentation these days about how it's important maybe to spend the money instead of spending it on expensive vestments or an expensive church, to spend it on the poor. But he knew the importance of it for the poor, the importance of the magnificence of the liturgy, also for the sake of Almighty God. That just made me think again about how we offer the liturgy and how we pray and how we worship, and how central, of course, that was to his life as a priest and as a friar.
Yeah. That's the first essay that I read, The Riches of Ritual. I got an interest in liturgy. and I was fascinated by that argument. And also, so the first thing that I thought about was that his stressing that this grandeur, which is properly ordered, you know, directing us to God, is there for the poor as well as the rich. There tends to be this assumption that somehow it's denied.
Yes.
It's there for all of us. We can all go into church and enjoy this, and it might be the only chance that people get to see such beauty actually properly ordered to what beauty is for, in a sense. And then the other argument I thought in connection with that is that even if your concern is purely material and you don't believe in that, it inspires people to charity and to love. Much of that can't be measured in material terms anyway, but so much of it can. I mean, there's a superabundance made available, in a sense, that wealth is created by economic activity, but the desire to do so for the good of others is more likely to be inspired by seeing that beauty in the church. And so I think it more than pays for itself anyway, but not that that's the principal argument.
Yes. Yeah.
And as you say, it's there as an inspiration to the poor. The other thing that struck me about that essay was he was trying to highlight how ritual is important and how it's natural to us. And he used the example of the evening meal as a ritual that still remained. And you think, gosh, that's if only that was present.
Times have changed.
Yeah, yes. And then I started to think, well, what is the modern equivalent? If it is natural to us to, shall we say, worship? We all worship, but it's just a question of whether we worship God or lesser gods with a small g. Here we are in a time where certainly there's some basis to what we're all doing. We're in lockdown, but there's an aspect of sort of ritual purity, isn't there, in the way that this is approached. And so I just think it would be an interesting exercise for each of us just to look at our lives and say, okay, where is the ritual in my life? Because I don't believe that you can scrap it altogether. If you get rid of the evening meal, which is actually a fine ritual because it points to the Eucharist, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's just a step removed. Whereas I wonder whether my rituals are taking me in all sorts of directions. And it made me think there's a moment for self-reflection. The fact that the example that he cited wouldn't apply so well today. So yeah, right.
No,
go on. Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, the situation at the moment is interesting because so many people's normal rituals have been shattered.
Yes.
And so they are all running around to try and find something else to replace them with. And if one looks at what the newspapers are reporting, all the television programs, it's all about people trying to find a different way of doing things that they can then ease themselves into and repeat. Because by doing this, first of all, it's quite comfortable to find a ritual that suits you. But the other thing is it's self-forgetful. If you get used to doing things in a certain patterned way, it allows your mind to focus on a particularly important element of it. Say the priest at Mass following a ritual in order to be able to forget parts of what he is and focus on the thing that he's doing, the action that he has at the altar, which is very important. But in more simple ways, it just allows people to rest. I think there's a certain amount of rest in ritual, which is really important.
That's
having to redo things again and again and exhaust ourselves by finding new ways always to do the same thing. We can actually find some rest and some room for contemplation on whatever level. In terms of doing something repeated.
Yes. So and as you say, it's not to say that any of these are necessarily bad things, but if they are the end, then that's the problem. When they're ordered to the highest ritual, which is what Father McNabb was directing us to in that essay, then that is a rich life indeed.
Yes, indeed.
I would say. Well, Mike, that's terrific. Is there anything you want to add before we finish? I want to thank you very much for your insights and the forward, which is beautiful. So I'll finish by just sort of recapping where people can find the book. But any closing thoughts at all?
I think we've touched upon this quite a bit. The importance of people to Father McNabb, the importance of being able to be touched by the actions of another soul. And there's just one little story I'd like to leave you with. He was at a funeral. He was officiating as priest at a funeral of a young child who had died. And the mother of the child, who was a Catholic, had died a number of years earlier. And so the only person left in the family was actually the husband, the father of the child who just died, who wasn't himself a Catholic and was a working man from a poor quarter of London. And they got to the graveyard, and the poor child was interred, and the rain started to come down. And Father McNabb was conscious of the poverty of the family, and also how stricken the husband and father was, having lost, first of all, his wife, and now his only child, his daughter. And the poor man scrabbled around in his pockets as the rain came down heavier and heavier, and tried to thrust some money that he'd got together, pennies, a collection of pennies, into Father McNabb's hand, and said, "You must take a taxi. You must take a taxi back to the priory. You mustn't walk in this terrible weather. It's very important for you to get back. You might be ill." And Father McNabb knew that this poor man himself had an even longer walk back to the tenement block in East London where he lived and would now live alone. And he was so touched by that instance of charity from someone, again, not of the household of the faith. But there in the graveyard, he got on his knees in front of this poor man and said, I cannot possibly take it. I cannot possibly take it. And the man was insistent. And in the end, McNabb realized it was his own pride that was refusing to take it. And so he relented and he took the money and he took the taxi back, and he thought of the man walking back in the rain to his empty tenement flat in East London. And that stayed with him in a way. That the touching charity of someone, not a Catholic, to a priest who he barely knew, who had officiated in a language that was unfamiliar to him at an important event in his life, his daughter's funeral. And it was that sort of mark that was left on the soul of McNabb by other people, and which he likewise made upon the soul of others whom he met, that remains with me all through this. It's a vein running through so many of his writings. There's this touching charity that, as you said earlier, the fact that he could wander into any room and people would know him for what he was, whether it was a drawing room, a salon of literary greats somewhere in a posh part of London in 1910, 1915, when he did mix and mingle with quite a lot of the literary giants of the day, or it was into a poor housing block somewhere else, whether it was Leicester or London, and people knew him for what he was, and he never changed. And he allowed himself to be touched by the charity of others, and that made him want to be charitable too, much more for the sake of them and for our Lord Jesus Christ. And that was very important to him. And his life is full of those little stories. There's lots of them dotted around in various biographical things that have been written about him. And they always move me because underneath, sometimes he could be quite stern. He was obviously a very deep thinker. He was immensely lucid, and people were sometimes frightened by his intellect. But there was a kindliness and a warmth in there, which sometimes you can lose sight of. Sometimes it's easy to forget how human a person can be underneath their writings. They say he wasn't necessarily a great writer, but underlying his writings, he was a great lover of our Lord Jesus Christ. And that, to me, is the key thing I return to him for time and time again.
That's wonderful and beautiful. Thank you. I've been talking to Mike Hennessy, and we've been talking about Father Vincent McNabb. Mike wrote the foreword to this published recently, or soon to be published, book of essays called The Wayside, A Priest's Gleanings, published by Pontifex University Press, available at thewayofbeauty.org/books. Mike, I want to say thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate your time.
No, thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.